Okay, if you haven't been under a rock for the past, 3 or 4 years, you'll have seen at least one of State Farm's commercials that feature NBA star Chris Paul. At first glance, they're just your typical quirky ads that are just supposed to be silly and not much more else to it. However, recently I noticed quite a peculiar State Farm ad with Chris Paul that made me have to do a little bit more digging. And so, after watching every single State Farm commercial featuring the NBA point guard, I'm gonna break down the details of the lore in these commercials and how it is broken into 3 separate eras: the Good Era, the Torment Era, and the Awakening Era, as well as how Chris Paul is actually being held captive by State Farm. So, let's get started. H.P. Lovecraft was a writer from the early 1900s who pioneered the horror genre with his atmospheric, cerebral take on horror. He wrote about cosmic entities beyond the comprehension of mortals that really paved the way for cerebral horrors, or essentially the fear of the unknown. I have come to the conclusion that Chris Paul has been trapped within a pocket dimension of a Lovecraftian monster that goes by the name State Farm. For the past several years, this being has been toying with the star point guard, wreaking havoc on his life. We start with the first arc, the Good Era.
Meet the Hoopers, the all-star family. With dad, mom, son, grandpa, and baby. With a good neighbor right next door. A system that would like is so much more. It's the Hoopers.
Now, the Good Days are a period of time that takes place between about 2016 and 2018. It involves the Chris Paul days, the Hoopers days, and the Oscar days. Now, what you'll notice right off the bat with these 3 are completely different realities, complete with 3 different State Farm agents. So, what can we take away from the Good Era? We learn that whatever the appearance and attributes of the dimension Chris Paul is trapped in can be changed with ease, with him none the wiser. We learn that the State Farm agents are always friendly but interchangeable, and are always closest to Chris in order to gather information about him, sometimes even being a mirror image of him. Why? Because the Good Days are meant to understand the psyche of Chris Paul. Right now, the various scenarios he is put in are mostly mundane, they're easy, they present Chris Paul with a level of comfortability as he is acclimated to the State Farm dimension. The people around him are those that the real Chris Paul knows, other NBA players, which adds to the sense that this pocket dimension is actually reality. Swiftly and abruptly, everything changed during the Torment Era of 2018 to 2020. It's one thing to know a man when he's emotionally stable, but it's an entirely different thing to see him when he's pushed to his limits. The Torment Era is when State Farm became bored with their prisoner Chris Paul. It was time to subject him to greater stresses. Now, here's an interesting thing to know about this era. We start off with Oscar Nunez as Chris Paul's agent. That's an important thing to consider for later. But what's really happening in the Torment Era? Chris Paul's home and his car and his other possessions are constantly under fire, literally, by various things. And as all this destruction happens, who is the one person Chris Paul has to turn to? That's right, it's his State Farm agent, Oscar. State Farm on the surface is tormenting Chris with these disasters, but below the surface, they're attempting to plant the seeds that his only hope, his only salvation, is State Farm. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's return to the Oscar issue. We've seen Oscar be a good friend to Chris Paul during the Good Era. We've seen him genuinely care about him, including actually showing remorse when bad things happen. What this indicates is that despite being part of the State Farm entity, Oscar began to develop his own personality and feelings, and that those feelings were ones of empathy for Chris and his predicament. This explains why his character suddenly vanishes from the commercials, because he could no longer bring himself to watch his best friend Chris constantly subjected to this torture. Now, it's unclear, but Oscar's character either re-emerged with the State Farm being, or is forcefully eliminated due to his closeness to Chris, with Jake from State Farm becoming his new agent going forward. And this, my friends, is where things really start to get interesting in the lore. Chris Paul has now been in the State Farm dimension for quite some time. He's formed a strong relationship with Oscar only to see it be taken away. So, what does State Farm do trying to rectify this situation and keep the illusion going? They, of course, give a face to Chris Paul's enemy, a tangible antagonist for him to focus his mistrust and hatred on. No more random deer, fire, or other accidents, but instead one person, a fake, an imposter, the new Chris Paul. This enemy works on two fronts. The first, as previously mentioned, is giving him someone to hate, a classic psychological tactic used by many. Basketball coach needs his guys to play as a team, say that the other team is talking trash about them. Country needs to go to war, use propaganda to make the other country seem as evil as possible to unite your people. The second purpose is to plant the seeds that maybe Chris Paul is replaceable, that he is not permanent in this dimension, only a guest in it, and that only by trusting in the holy State Farm can he be saved from this replacement. And how does Jake from State Farm fit into this? Well, for starters, when bad things happen to Chris, Jake lacks the empathy we saw Oscar had. He simply does not care for the well-being of Chris like his predecessor. This coldness from the agent exists because Jake and Chris are never seen bonding like Oscar and Chris. They are never given the opportunity. Not only that, but we see Jake with a myriad of other random and famous people alike, in order to keep him disconnected from Chris, rather than the two always being together. Jake, more so than any other agent, is just an extension of State Farm, rather than an actual person with actual thoughts. There is, of course, an argument to be made that this switch from Agent Oscar to Agent Jake is significant enough to be a distinct era. However, after giving it some thought, this distinction is simply an adjustment made by State Farm, rather than a holistic transition into a new style for the dimension. And this, my friends, leads us into the third and final era of Chris Paul State Farm commercials. Welcome to the Awakening era.
Let me see that book.
I'm Jake from State Farm.
Is this a commercial?
This is the current stage of the State Farm dimension, and when I really started to pick up on the sinister nature of the commercials. Chris Paul has now persisted in the dimension for so long he has become conscious of his torment. When he hears the State Farm jingle, he immediately is sent into a panic. His torture now comes not from seeing his home and other possessions destroyed, but rather the fear that something might get destroyed, might go wrong, only to have his fears seemingly made to look stupid and unfounded. State Farm is taking the fact that Chris Paul is conscious of the pocket dimension and its tricks, and now using this knowledge against him to continue his torment. And then, of course, there is the occasional moment when the power of State Farm is shown, such as when Chris Paul is turned into a basketball or a cardboard cutout in the blink of an eye.
Chris smiles and says, "Wow, love State Farm's surprisingly great rates." Then suddenly his body turns into a basketball. Come on, this stuff is... Says, "Wow, I love State Farm's surprisingly great rates." And suddenly Chris and Sabrina turn into life-size cardboard cutouts.
So, this is where the story currently is. Chris Paul is aware of the dimension, but is powerless to stop it. I fear what will happen next to our dear point god, when State Farm becomes bored of this era. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Until then, keep an eye on your good neighbor. Thanks for watching.